My name is Jake Youngers, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics here at the University of Minnesota. I teach classes and do research on topics related to sustainable agriculture. Although I don't have a background in farming and did not grow up in an agricultural community, I was always passionate about the environment and nature. That passion led me to pursue degrees in conservation biology. Those degrees set me down a career path to try to solve environmental problems through agriculture. So let's review some of the environmental issues that are related to annual row cropping. Annual row crops, which have really shallow root systems so that they can put a bunch of their energy into big seeds and lots of seeds. These annual row crops with shallow root systems only live for about 4 to 5 months out of the year. The remaining time, that land is left fallow, and that means the soil is exposed to wind and water and can be washed away, swept away, which is what we call erosion. Perennial crops can reduce soil erosion because they have deep, dense roots, and the perennial plants stay alive all year round. Even in the winter months, perennial crops provide cover so that the soil cannot be blown away or washed away as easily. The deep, dense roots also help build organic matter in that soil, which could make the farm field more profitable for farmers. So why are all of our crops annuals? Well, because an annual plant only has one shot to reproduce, 1 year to produce seeds, it almost always produces either really big seeds that are really sure to survive, or they produce lots and lots of really small seeds. On the other hand, a perennial crop has the luxury of waiting for a good year to produce seeds. Think about an oak tree. Some years there's lots of acorns falling from an oak tree, and other years there's not. So a perennial crop can wait for the conditions to be right to produce those seeds, to ensure that those seeds actually turn into young plants. So if you're thinking about crops, we don't want crops to just wait for a good year to produce seeds. We need crops to produce seeds every year. And we need crops to produce big seeds, or lots of them, so that we can get the most food from an acre of land. So that's the inherent challenge, is finding a perennial plant that can produce lots of seeds, or big seeds, year in and year out consistently, so that farmers can rely on getting a profitable yield from that crop. Here at the University of Minnesota, we're developing the world's first perennial grain crop. We're taking an old forage grass called intermediate wheatgrass and breeding it so that it has larger seeds and more seeds, so that farmers can use those and sell them profitably for grain. We're sitting here in a field of new and improved lines of intermediate wheatgrass. The grain that's harvested from these new lines is called Kernza. And Kernza is the world's first perennial grain crop that has nutritional benefits for humans, provides ecosystem services, and new economic opportunities for farmers. So here's an intermediate wheatgrass plant. This is one plant. You can see it has lots of stems and lots of seed heads coming off of those stems. The plant itself stands about 3.5 feet tall, but it has roots that go down at least 3.5 feet. Here's a picture of a Kernza plant that was taken by Jim Richardson from National Geographic. This plant was grown at the Land Institute, a partnering nonprofit organization in Salina, Kansas, that has been working with us to develop Kernza. The gentleman here is holding a plant that was grown in a specialized chamber so that we could see the roots after it grows. The big question is, how deep do the roots really get in soils in Minnesota and in soils in different types of growing regions across the United States? That's what we've set out to determine with this project. So how deep can Kernza roots actually get? Some people have measured Kernza roots as deep as 9 feet below the soil surface. Here in St. Paul, Minnesota, we easily see roots getting down to 3 feet deep and sometimes deeper. We're also interested to know how much roots are at various sections of the soil profile. So, are there more roots in the shallow part of the soil, or do we see more roots in the deeper parts of the soil? That's what we're trying to figure out here in this study by taking photographs of roots at various depths. To study Kernza roots, we use a specialized camera called a mini rhizotron. The mini rhizotron is a camera that's about 8 inches long, and it fits into a clear tube that's buried right next to a Kernza plant. This clear tube is about 3 feet long and sits right next to the roots of the plant. The camera is inserted into the clear tube, and then it stops and rotates to take a picture that's 360 degrees in circle, so they can capture all of the roots growing right around the tube. The camera is then inserted further into the tube to continue collecting images at deeper depths, all the way down to the 3-foot depth. Here's a raw image collected by the Rhizotron camera. You can see the roots growing up alongside the clear tube. Next, the research team traces the roots using a specialized software program. By tracing the roots with this software program, we can measure the length of each root. After the length is measured, we make adjustments to the trace to account for the diameter of the roots. And that's really important because roots with a larger diameter, or coarse roots, decompose slower than fine roots. And we want to know how long these roots actually stay in the ground, how fast they die, and how fast they grow. So we also need to measure the fine roots and measure the diameter of those as well. We take photos of roots at least once a month, and then we trace those roots and compare the images from 1 month to the next. Here we can see a comparison of the exact same plant and the same depth from images in May and August. And we can see that some roots died over that period of time and some roots grew. We've also learned that about 50% of all of the biomass, all of the weight of a root, is carbon. And that was carbon that was pulled from the atmosphere during photosynthesis and moved down to the roots. And that carbon that's in the roots now might someday turn into organic matter and eventually soil carbon, where it can be stored for decades or maybe even centuries. This activity helps solve climate change by pulling carbon that was once in CO2 out of the atmosphere to reduce global warming. So let's recap. Today we learned that most of our crops are annuals, and that annual crops don't produce a lot of root biomass, so that they can produce lots of seeds and large seeds for high grain yields. However, this presents some environmental challenges like soil erosion and greenhouse gas emissions. Here at the University of Minnesota, we're developing the world's first perennial grain crop called Kernza. This crop produces deep, dense root systems that provide environmental benefits while also producing nutritious, high-yielding grain. We looked at one way that researchers can measure and monitor root growth at various depths and throughout the growing season. And this information is really important for helping us quantify the environmental benefits of this new perennial grain crop.
All plants, including the crops that feed us, need rain to grow and thrive. But when there's too much rain, it can erode soil, cause more diseases and pests, prevent or delay the planting of crops, or completely destroy crops that have been growing. For example, record rainfall in the spring of 2019 caused over 33 million in damages in Minnesota, and much of that was in crops and croplands. And the worrisome thing is that this is quickly becoming our new normal. So Minnesota's climate and our weather are becoming warmer and wetter. You can see in these two figures, the red line on the left and the blue line on the right are the 9-year averages. You can see that both of those are increasing over time. This means that we will be seeing more of these large storms with unpredictable timing and even large periods of drought in between. Unpredictability and severe storms are becoming the new normal as our climate continues to change at a rapid pace. So then back to the image from the video I showed earlier. What do you see here? There's bare soil being washed away and corn in the background and soybean crops. And the big question is, do different crops or the way we manage them change their ability to withstand this kind of big rainfall event? Or if we imagine the opposite of a big drought where there's a long period between rainfall. So now I want to show you some different pictures of crops that we can keep imagining that. Here is a soybean crop at different stages. You can see the bigger plants in the background with smaller plants with more bare soil and space in between them closer to the front of these images. And peaking even at the more mature crop, you can see that there are large spaces of bare soil. Here is an example of corn as well. And especially this young corn, which is what we would expect in the spring, has lots and lots of bare soil. And so we could imagine in the springtime that this crop would be very vulnerable to big, big storms. Here is an example of wheat. You can see that there are still spaces between the plants, but these plants are much more densely packed together. And what I haven't talked about yet that we'll look at more in a minute is that the roots between these plants are also kind of growing more closely together underneath the soil and protecting that soil a little bit more. But let's even take this a step further and look at some perennial systems. This is alfalfa. So if you've ever driven by an alfalfa field, you know that it can be hard to even tell the rows. And we know that the roots are growing really densely underneath this plant also. Likewise, this is a perennial grain crop called Kernza, and the plant is called intermediate wheatgrass. You can also imagine that if we have a crop like this, or if we had a cover crop to plant between our annual row crops like corn or soybeans, that is growing really quickly in the spring and growing those roots really quickly in the spring, we won't have to worry quite as much about how wet it was or whether or not we could get a plant into that field, because it's going to grow even if it's very wet. We don't have to worry about planting it. And it will also be able to hopefully withstand those big storms. And so this is what I focus on in my research. I use tools like the rainout shelter on the left that can create a drought by blocking rainfall from a part of a field, or this rainfall simulator, or we can rain on a crop as severely as we want to see what happens to that crop and what happens to the soil underneath it. Now I'm going to show you a video where I talk through and show you this rainfall simulator in action.
So this behind me is a rainfall simulator. We are testing whether different cropping systems will provide a buffer or an insurance policy to really big storms. You can imagine with a really high quality soil or really low quality soil, they'll have really different capacities to let extra water run through instead of running off and creating erosion or other problems on the landscape.
Let's go back now to the image from the video that I showed in the beginning. Again, we have different plants and crops growing, and we have a lot of bare soil, part of it on that really compacted roadway, part of it on this field that are being washed away. And I want to kind of take a deeper look into the soil itself. So this is our first image of what those roots look like that I was referring to earlier. And I must admit that this is my very, very favorite part of this talk, is when we get to dig into the soil and really look at what a healthy soil looks like. And the reason that I want to mention how excited I am is that I'm sure all of you, as you're going through school, start to have different interests, and all of those interests and passions, no matter what they are, play a huge role in solutions to our environmental problems. So if we could draw out what this soil looks like, take a moment and look at all the detail in this picture. You see roots growing. There are fungal hyphae wrapping themselves around the roots and these soil particles. You can see that there is this worm-like nematode swimming toward the bottom. All of these differently colored life forms growing and moving through the soil and tying or gluing these different soil particles together into a really, really stable structure. And this is what protects us from both drought and from storms. Here again are examples from different cropping systems. Here is, on one side, is a soil with lots and lots of roots growing with lots of live plants. And here is, on the other side, is a soil that is not so well structured, and it easily crumbles in your hands. To show this in another cartoon, what this really nice soil with all these roots and that live worm are doing are letting the roots grow more. There's more aeration, which means that all of those life forms can live a lot more easily and breathe oxygen if they breathe oxygen. That really strong structure lets water flow through. And so if there's a big storm, we know that a really healthy soil will let the water flow through that soil instead of ponding and creating all that damage. And we also know that there's less soil erosion, because if the soil is running through and being processed, we're not going to see the flood carrying literally the topsoil away with it. And this is the power of a healthy soil. To go back to this image I showed before, the blue here is water that's being held in this really nicely developed soil. So not only are these crops and healthy soils filtering out extra water, but they are also holding water for us that'll help our plants and our crops get through droughts. Soil health gives us hope. Again, it'll help improve infiltration and letting extra water go through. We can improve water holding capacity, which means that we're holding more water to get us through very dry times. And just to close with one image, here's another flood where we have a cover crop growing, and it has been able to filter this water so well, where in another field nearby, there's lots and lots of water ponding and starting to create problems for this land. And the goal is that when these big storms come or big droughts, we'll be ready.
So today we're going to be making delicious chocolate chip cookies made from Kernza flour. So the first thing you're going to need to do is make sure you have all the ingredients. And those ingredients are 1/3 cup soft shortening, 1/3 cup soft butter, 1/2 cup packed brown sugar, 1 egg, 1 teaspoon vanilla, 1 cup all-purpose flour, 1/2 cup Kernza flour, 1/2 teaspoon of soda, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1/2 cup chopped nuts and now remember that's optional, and 1 1/4 cups chocolate chips. Now once you have all of your ingredients together, the first step is going to be heating your oven to 375 degrees. The next step is mixing the shortening, sugars, egg, and vanilla thoroughly. Then you're going to be blending the dry ingredients and stir into the shortening mixture. The next step is to mix in the chocolate chips and nuts. And remember, those nuts are optional. Once you have all of the ingredients mixed together, you're going to be dropping round spoonfuls about 2 inches apart onto an ungreased baking sheet. Parchment paper is highly recommended. Then you'll be placing the cookie sheet into the oven to bake the cookies 8 to 10 minutes. Remove the baked cookies from the oven. The final step is to let the cookies cool slightly before removing from the baking sheet. And then you have Kernza chocolate chip cookies. Enjoy.